We begin the program with Arizona Senator John McCain. Senator, it's so good to have you here.
Thanks, Al.
Was the president's trip to Europe a failure as far as that's concerned?
I'm not so sure it was a failure because it depends on your expectations. I expected little or nothing from the Europeans. I really did. Their dependence on energy, everything about their attitudes now, their slashes of their defense spending.
Russian troops are amassed on the Ukrainian border. You've talked about it. Do you expect Putin to strike soon?
I predicted that he would go to Crimea after Yanukovych was driven out of Ukraine because Sevastopol is the naval base which gives the Russian fleet access to the Mediterranean. And if you look at Putin's vision and ambition to restore the Russian near abroad, he couldn't do without that base. I did not predict that he would move into Ukraine, and I still think that he won't, but Al, you don't keep troops massed on the border of a country for no reason. Right. If you'd asked me about 3 or 4 days ago, I'd have said, I believe not. Now I'm not sure, because he's got these troops. It gets very expensive to keep troops massed in that fashion, and you don't mass troops on the border of a country unless you've got some intention. But the consequences, I would think, he must be thinking the cost-benefit ratio.
Well, you've called for military assistance to the Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Do you worry that that might incite him? That if you do that,
but isn't the flip side also true? If they don't get assistance, wouldn't that encourage him to exercise further adventurism? And isn't there a moral situation here, Al? The Ukrainians would not fight over Crimea. They say they'll fight over the mainland of Ukraine. If they're going to fight, and I believe I take their word for it, then why not give them some weapons with which to defend themselves? Symbolically, it means so much. They look to us. The one thing Americans do not understand is how much it matters to these countries what we say and do. And if we said, okay, we're going to give you some defensive weapons and they're coming and we're going to assist you, that would boost their morale. I can't tell you how much it would boost their morale, even if it had little or no effect. But also, can I make one other thing? Putin's calculation also has to be, what is the cost if he goes into eastern Ukraine? There's another theory we got to watch out for, and that is he goes across the south of Ukraine, all the way across to Moldova, thereby cutting off Ukraine from any access to the Black Sea. That may be one of his plans that he's thinking seriously about.
Well, if he does that, if he goes to Ukraine, and maybe Georgia even, you've raised all those possibilities. You have said no American boots. Moldova. But you've said no American boots on the ground. But if he does all of that and keeps going, well, could there come a time where there'd have to be an American-led NATO force there to try to deter him, or is that off the table?
I would have to say that in Moldova, because they are not members of NATO, I think it would be very questionable. But I think it would have to be some kind of consideration, but I doubt if Europeans, frankly, would agree to it. In the case of the Baltic countries, who are under enormous pressure from Putin, they're now members of NATO, Article 5, which says attack on one is attack on all. It would be hard for me to believe that there wouldn't be a NATO response to an outright invasion of one of the Baltic countries.
A military response.
Yeah. I just can't believe we wouldn't have some kind of military response.
Senator,
but it also makes me believe that he probably wouldn't do it directly. He's trying to undermine these countries.
You've been skeptical of the economic sanctions, but the World Bank said it's going to hurt. It's going to push Russia into a recession. There's going to be a huge surge in capital flight. Wall Street guys have told me that new investments are just drying up. No new investments are going in there. If that's the case, even if Putin is, as you say, a KGB thug, isn't that going to have to affect him?
Long term, I've said I thought it was a pretty good line. Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. They're now the 13th largest economy. Their long-term prospects are abysmal, no matter whether they went to Ukraine or not, because it's a country based on corruption and kleptocracy and autocracy. But in the short term, look, his approval just went up dramatically in Russia because he's being a tough guy. If he goes into eastern Ukraine, he's going to have some significant gains there as far as his economy is concerned.
So the economic impact, if any, will,
I think
will
it
be
will
later.
be. Again, I'm not sure how the world reacts because, you know, one of the reasons why there was so tepid response by the Europeans is these incredible strong economic ties between Germany and these other countries. But also, one of our long-term strategies has got to be, and this has been widely discussed, this is not startling, is our assistance in getting them an energy independence from Russia.
If the short term is to squeeze, is to really squeeze, should pressure be applied to American companies, big ones like General Electric and PepsiCo and ExxonMobil, all of whom have 4 big investments in Russia? Should there be pressure for them to pull out?
Yes, I think
there should be,
or at least suspension of business, something that would be a punishment to.
And should the government, should Congress and the administration pressure them to do that?
Not so much pressure them, but if we declare sanctions of a certain kind with their companies and corporations, obviously it would inhibit their way to do business, their ability to do business there. And I know that that's a tough call, and I know that we don't want to hurt our own economy. But what are the consequences of Vladimir Putin just being able to act in a way that, and by the way, these kinds of sanctions you're talking about would only be if he went much further, would only be considered if he went much further. Look, after the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter, admittedly not my favorite American president, he took some pretty tough steps, some pretty tough measures at that time. And I think we have to just understand that if we let this kind of thing unchecked, it not only allows Putin a free rein, but what's the message around the world?
You've suggested that Obama's been too weak, but you look at history, 2 of your favorite presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, he really couldn't stop those tanks rolling into Hungary, and Ronald Reagan, they declared martial law in Poland. He couldn't stop that. Isn't it the truth that when Russia decides to move on its neighbors, we really can't do much about it?
Well, I think, first of all, they were behind the Iron Curtain, and they were part of the then Soviet Union, whether for better or for worse. Second of all, Ronald Reagan, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, won the Cold War without firing a shot. Peace through strength. We're slashing our defense spending dramatically. Chuck Hagel testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee about our cuts in defense the day the Chinese announced an increase of 12.2% in their defense spending. There's ways of showing strength without having to get into an open conflict. And I think history shows the weaker you are, the more likely it is for aggressors to misbehave.
John McCain, thank you so much for being with us today. And when we return, Obamacare enrollment and a critical decision by the NLRB. We'll be right back.